ears or the imagination have the ability to go from one thing to another, right? But reason is also able to come to know something through knowing other things. Huh? And the act, which is so characteristic of reason that it gets its name from reason, namely reasoning, right? In reasoning, you're coming to know one statement through what? Other statements. You're coming to know the conclusion through the premises, right? Okay? But in defining, you're coming to know one thing to another, right? One comes to know what blank verse is through unrhymed and iambic and what? Pentameter, right? One comes to know what an iamb is through syllable and accent and second and so on, right? Okay? So reason is the ability to know one thing through knowing other things. And that separates reason from the senses. Because I don't see one pain through seeing another pain. I can look at you and then look at him, but I don't see him through seeing you. I can hear one movement, the first movement of Mozart's symphony, and I can hear the second movement, right? But I don't hear the second movement through hearing the first movement. See? But when I define, I come to know what something is I didn't know before through things I know already. See? I sometimes ask students, what is a perfect number, right? In arithmetic, they don't know, right? But they know what a number is, right? They know what it is to be what? Measured by something, right? Measured evenly, right? They know what it is to be what? Equal, right? And I put all these things together and I say it's a number that is equal to the sum of everything they measured there. Oh, that's what it is. Right? Okay? So they're coming to know what something is that they didn't know through things they did know already. Okay? So defining and reasoning are two kinds of what? Discourse, right? In the sense of what? Coming to know the unknown through the known, right? Counting and calculating are two other ways, right? When I count, I come to know a number through the one, right? When I calculate, add, subtract, multiply, divide, I come to know a number I didn't know through some numbers that I what? Didn't know, right? Huh? Okay. So what Shakespeare is telling us here, in the Middle Ages, sometimes discourses was used as a synonym almost for reasoning, right? Okay. But if you want a discourse that separates reason from the eye and the ear and the imagination, which are the closest to it, right? Other knowing powers, you'd have to say not only that reason is the ability to know one thing before or after another, and even the senses can do that, right? But reason is the ability to what? Come to know something unknown, right? Through things that are what? Known. Yeah. And that's seen especially in reasoning, right? Which is so characteristic of reason that it's named from reason. Right? Reasoning is not just going from one statement to another, right? But it's coming to know a statement, which in logic we call the conclusion, right? Through at least two other statements, which are called the premises, right? Okay. Calculating is coming to know a number you didn't know through numbers you did know, right? I get to the checkout counter in the grocery store, and I know the cost of everything I put into my basket, right? But I don't know yet the cost I have to pay, right? I could come to know that number by adding the numbers that my basket. My wife is very fast sometimes to beat it there. See if she's got enough. Right? Okay? Do you see that? Okay. So that's the first thing. Now I think we're running short now, 5:20. Yeah, we're going to stop here. Oh, well. Yeah. So reason is the ability to come to know one thing through another. Okay? I get to go on together. Right. Okay. But as you think about it, I'll give you this other one which has a list of the questions here. Okay. So we should be studying. Just a few of the things you can learn from this exhortation. Who else needs a copy?
want these?
Copy on this? Okay, next copy,
Yeah.
I'll keep one for myself, so I can do it. Yeah, we'll kind of explain the rest of the definition, then we'll start to go through these ones to make sure we pose questions. Right? Okay. So, Deo gratias.
Ready? Let's say our little prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God, our enlightenment. Guardian angels, strengthen the lights of our minds, order and illumine our images, and arouse us to consider more correctly. St. Thomas Aquinas, angelic doctor.
Pray for us.
And help us to understand all that you have written. In the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Trying to understand the definitions, that the first word, really, the fundamental word, the fundamental part of a definition that comes before all the rest, is called in logic the genus. And the genus states in a general way what the thing is. So like in the definition of square, the genus is quadrilateral, right? And that states what a square is, but in a general way in common with other things. And then you add differences to complete that definition. Okay? Like equilateral and right angle to complete the definition of square. Now what's the genus here of the definition of reason? What's the fundamental word?
Capability.
Capability, yeah. Which I take the liberty of shortening to ability, right? Okay? That's the first thing you have to realize, that reason is an ability. Reason is an ability to do something, but the basic idea here is that it's an ability. Now, when you define an ability, after starting with the word ability, you have to complete that definition by telling or saying what it's an ability for, right? Okay. So, you have to state for what it is an ability. Okay. You don't know an ability except through what it's an ability for. You don't even know you have an ability unless you do that for which it is an ability. And that's why sometimes people do amazing things in the athletic field and they say, I didn't know I had it in me. Mm-hmm. But they had an ability that was undiscovered, right? Or unknown, let's say, to that point. Now, Shakespeare has a number of words there that are going to say what it's an ability for, right? It's ability for large discourse, and then he'll add later on, looking before and after, right? But a second thing we might say is that we define an ability not only by what it is an ability for, but we define ability by the utmost of which it is capable. Okay. Now let me illustrate that with two very simple examples I use all the time. Suppose a man is able to lift 300 pounds, right? But he can't lift 301 pounds. That 301 pound would be like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, right? He can lift 300 pounds. Now, if a man can lift 300 pounds, he's also able to lift 200 pounds, right? Or 100 pounds. In fact, he can do them easier than 300 pounds, right? But if you want to define that man's weightlifting ability, what would you define it by? 100 or 200 or 300?
300.
Yeah. Because if you said he has the ability to lift 100 pounds or 200 pounds, that's true, It doesn't tell you the full or complete ability of the man, does it? Okay? Why an ability to lift 300 pounds, if you think about it, is included the ability to lift 200 or 100 pounds. Huh? You see that? Okay. If I can run a mile in 5 minutes, but I can't do it in less than 5 minutes, right? I'm also able to run it in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, right? It may be easier to do it in 10 or 15 minutes than in 5 minutes. But if you want to define my capacity, my ability there, you do it by the ability to run a mile in 5 minutes, not 10 or 15, right? Okay? So, the first word that Shakespeare uses, and every other word he uses here, maybe you want to bear in mind these two things, right? Okay? So the first thing he tells us is that reason is an ability for discourse. Okay? It's an ability to discourse. Now we mentioned two meanings of the word discourse. It comes from the Latin word to run, right? To run hither or thither. Okay? So reason is able to go from one thing to another. Okay? But it's also able to what? Know one thing through another. It's able to come to know something it didn't know through things that it does know. As when it reasons, right? It comes to know a statement it didn't know through other statements that it did know. Huh? And you'll see that in Euclid as he goes through one theorem, right? He uses things that he's seen before in order to see something new, right? And when you define, you come to know what something is through other things that you know, right? So he came to know what blank verse was through I am and through what? Yeah, and through unrhymed, right? If you didn't know what I am was, we came to know that through knowing what syllables are and two syllables are and the accent on the second syllable, right? Okay? And calculating, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing is coming to know one through the other, right? Coming to know a number you didn't know through at least two numbers that you did know. Now, included, you could say, in the ability to know, come to know one thing through other things is included the ability to go from one thing to another. Okay? But we define reason more by the ability to know one thing through other things, because that shows you the what? Utmost of its ability, huh? Do you see that? Okay? Now, why does Shakespeare define it by discourse? Why doesn't he say something about what we talked about before, that there are some things that reason, as it were, naturally understands? Huh? Why does he not say that?
Because other things besides reason can do that. So let's see. Doesn't something with the sense do that? It can recognize
Okay, that's
something.
perhaps part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, if your eyes see something coming right at you, you don't think about it, you just get out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And react to
Yeah,
it.
yeah. But they're really so much using your reason in that case, maybe, yeah?
You can use those things that it already that it has a natural understanding of
Yeah,
to come to
Yeah.
things that it doesn't.
yeah. If there weren't some things we knew without discourse, we wouldn't be able to discourse at all. Huh? Like I was saying before with reasoning. If you understood nothing before reasoning, you'd have nothing to reason from, right? If you didn't know what anything was before you defined, you had nothing with which to define. See? So in a way, that there are some things that you know without discourse is before discourse, right? But what reason naturally understands without discourse is rather general and rather what?
Natural.
Yeah, and not very precise, right? And so reason can go beyond that, right? Through discourse, and you can come to know things more particularly and more expansively, right? Okay. could also say that, though, even in those things that we naturally understand, like a whole is larger than one of its parts, to some extent we arrive at that by a discourse, because experience comes before any universals. So from experience we get, in a way, the universal. So even the things we naturally understand, there's something of a spontaneous, you might say, right? Discourse. Huh? Okay, from experience of whole and part, we get the idea of whole and part, and then we see that a whole must be more than a part, and so on. Okay? So there's various ways you can see why you would say discourse rather than anything else here as a starting point. Huh? Okay? But a sign of that, too, is that the act which is most characteristic of reason, that gets its name from reason, namely reasoning, right, is a discourse, right? Okay? So we see that it's most characteristic of reason, huh? Reasoning. Just what's most characteristic of the sense of taste is tasting, right? Okay? But discourse is a little bit broader in meaning than reasoning. It includes defining and counting and calculating and so on, huh? Okay? So that's the first word he uses to say what it's an ability for. It's an ability for discourse, right? And reason is able to come to know something unknown, do things it knows, huh? Okay. In a way, that's the way Albert the Great talks about logic, right? The logic is the art of what? Using what you know to come to know what you don't know. And defining is one way, and reasoning is the other way. He divides logic as the art of defining and reasoning, right? Okay. But now Shakespeare adds an adjective here. And he says that reason is the ability for large discourse. Now, what does this word large mean? Well, I think it has about 6 meanings here, okay? But to begin with, you can say that a discourse, a reason, can be called large in 3 ways. Huh? It could be said to be about the large, okay? Or because its limit is large, or, and this is stretching the word a little bit more, but in Shakespeare's time it would be this broader way, because the discourse itself is large, meaning that it's long, right? Okay. Now, each of these is going to have 2 under it. Now, there's 2 ways you could understand large here when you say the discourse of reason about the large. Huh? One is that it's about the universal. What is common to many, what is said in there, right? We quoted Boethius before that a thing is singular when sensed, but universal when understood. Now you could say that universal, in a way, covers a large area if you wanted to, right? It said of many things. So if I have a discourse about odd numbers, let's say, and even numbers, how many things does odd number cover? Infinity, yeah. And when I make a statement like no odd number is even, I'm in a way making a statement about an infinity of things, right? Okay? So it covers, it's a very large discourse, right? Okay? Now the other sense of large is large as opposed to small, as in small talk. Small talk means what? Talk about little things, unimportant things, right? Okay. And the opposite of large then would be, in that sense, would be great things, right? Okay. So it can discourse about great things. Huh? Now, notice, reason can also discourse about the singular, right? Can also discourse about little things, right? But Shakespeare doesn't define reason as the ability for small discourse, even though reason is more capable of a small discourse than a large one, in this sense. But you wouldn't understand the full ability of reason, right? Okay? I can not only talk about those things that happen today, but I can talk about what? The soul, the immortality of the soul, the order of the universe. I can talk about God himself, right? See? So reason is capable of a discourse about great things. And it can talk not only about the singular, but it can talk about the universal. And in wisdom, we talk about the what? Most universal. Now, generally speaking, the discourse of the philosopher will be larger than other men in both of these senses. Okay, with the possible exception of the theologian, right? Okay, but leaving aside the theologian for a moment, you can see this in wisdom itself, right? We saw that in the description there, the sixth part, description of the wise man. But he talks about what is said of all things. So his discourse is most large. It's the largest of all in this sense here. And he talks about the first cause. And the first cause is God. So he talks about the greatest thing. Right? So the discourse of the wise man is the largest discourse there is for natural reason. Okay. Now, you could also say that, or call the discourse of reason large because its limit is large. The limit is said both of the what? Beginning and the what? End, right? Okay. Now, you'll find very often that reason arrives at one universal and simple truth by a large induction, right? Okay, so it makes an induction from many singulars to one universal thing. Okay, so that I see that expression sometimes in other authors even. A large induction, right? See, that means you took it from many things, right? But you went from many, that was your beginning, right, to one simple truth, right? Okay. But likewise, reason sometimes sees one simple but very basic truth, something very universal, and then it sees many what? Consequences of this, right? Or it makes many applications of this, right? Okay. I can see that also in the equations of the physicist, right? From one equation, how many things are being deduced? Force equals mass times acceleration. By plugging in different forces or masses, you can what? Calculate an infinity of different accelerations, right? Okay. The axioms, right, are used in almost every theorem of Euclid, right? So from one axiom, there are many, many, many different things that are what? Seen, right? Okay. And again, perhaps the wise man, his discourse is the largest in both of these senses, because he has the most universal what? He has the largest in sense of induction. As Monsieur Duane pointed out, he needs an experience, not just of many singulars, but an experience of all the particular parts of philosophy before he can see this thing universally. And he sees principles, right, that can be applied everywhere. Okay? So, reason is capable of a large discourse in these two senses too. Okay? Okay. Now, the third way we can speak of a discourse as being large is because in some way it's long. And again, there's two ways we speak of a discourse as long. One would be if it goes through many what? Steps, right? Now, if you start to go through, say, book 1 of Euclid, you have to go through many steps to arrive at the later theorems. So if someone comes to me and says, Berquist, show me the Pythagorean theorem. And I say, well, the only proof I know is proposition 47 in book 1 of Euclid. So you have to go through 46 things. You know? And that's when the king is supposed to protest it, right? And he wanted a short road, right? And Euclid is supposed to have said, there's no royal road to Johnny, right? Anybody who's a king or a commoner, right? A slave, if he's going to know the Pythagorean theorem, he's got to go through all these steps, right? Okay. Now notice again, when we say that reason is capable of doing that, and so Euclid is capable of doing that, right? We don't mean that it's as easy for reason to go through a many-step argument than it is when there's just a couple of steps, right? In fact, when it's a couple of steps, he's more capable of, right? But you don't fully understand the ability of reason unless you realize it can go through these many steps. Huh? And perhaps in the sense of geometry, arithmetic, or the other part of philosophy, you have a long discourse in the sense of many steps. Huh? Okay. Now, the other way you can speak of a discourse as being long is that it goes between things that are very far apart, right? Okay. Between things very far apart. You probably heard of the first proof of the existence of God, right? Which goes from motion all the way to God, right? But when you study motion, you find out that it's hardly actual, right? It's hardly there. See, when I'm moving here, right, part of my motion has gone by, and part of my motion is to come, right? Mm-hmm. And the part that's gone by doesn't exist. The part that's to come doesn't exist yet. And how much motion is ever actual? Mm-hmm. No part of motion is ever fully actual. So you go from motion, which is the least actual of acts, right, all the way to God, and you find out that God is what? Pure act. Therefore, he's universally perfect. That's going as far almost as you could go, right? Okay. And sometimes Thomas reasons from matter, but the furthest, even further away from God. And he speaks of matter has in some way the ability to be infinitely different things, right? And he goes from that to God's infinite ability, right? That's a tremendous distance, right? Okay. We see that too in Scripture when you speak of God metaphorically, right? The Lord is my rock. Huh? Mm-hmm. Well, quite a distance between a rock and God, right? Huh? And even further apart than the soul and God, right? The rock and God, right? But we're in a sense going from the rock to God, right? That's going an awful long way. Do you see that? Yeah? Okay. So again, that's difficult reason to do, but it's capable of that. Huh? Okay. And of course, the wise man especially goes in this way. You look at the books in wisdom there, the 11th through the 14th, especially 11 and 12, where Aristotle arrives at the first cause. He starts in the most imperfect of all things, the most imperfect beings. He goes up towards the more perfect beings, and you finally arrives at God. But that's the longest discourse that your mind will make in this sense down here. So, but maybe in mathematics we make a longer discourse in this sense here, right? Okay. But at least in 5 of these 6 senses, the discourse of the wise man is the largest of all, right? But even in the other parts of philosophy, when we get into natural philosophy, the discourse is much more universal than it is for the experimental scientist. We get into ethics. In ethics, we talk about all the goods of man. That's what Socrates and the Athenians were disagreeing about. The order of all the goods of man. So, I mean, it's very universal compared to the art of cooking, or the medical art, or these arts that deal with one particular good, right? And, ethics talks about the purpose of man, right? Okay. Of course, in natural philosophy, later on, we talk about the soul. That's a very great thing, right? It's not as great as God, but it's... So, you could say in general, the discourse of the philosopher is larger than other men, but what does that mean? In almost all of these senses, it's its discourse is larger. Okay. So Shakespeare's saying an awful lot, right? When he says that reason is the ability for large discourse. Huh? But he doesn't stop there. Okay. Now, the next word that Shakespeare adds is the word looking. Huh? And let's look at that word by itself before we look at what he adds to that, before and after, right? Let's just take the word looking. Huh? Now, if we tried to define looking, how would you define it?
Trying to see.
Yeah, trying to see, right? Okay. Okay. Now, to see has three meanings. Huh? And the first meaning, of course, is the act of the eye, right? That's really the only name for that act. Huh?
Okay.
The second meaning of to see is to imagine, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the first meaning is the act of the eye. The second meaning is to imagine. And you see this in the beginning of Hamlet there, huh? The friends of Hamlet have seen the ghost of his what? Father walking the ramparts there at Elsinore, right? Castle. And they see it with their eyes. Okay? And they're going to tell Hamlet about this. And before they have a chance to tell him, Hamlet says, I can see my father now. And they're looking around as if he's seen the ghost, right? And he says, in my mind's eye, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay? But then he means what? He can picture his father in his imagination, right? Okay? Later on, he sees him with his eyes, right? Okay? Now, the third meaning of to see would seem to be to understand. Okay? And notice there's an order there. The word to see is an example of what the philosopher calls a word equivocal by reason. Equivocal means it has more than one meaning. Huh? Now, sometimes a word has more than one meaning by chance. But other times it has more than one meaning by reason. And then there's going to be some kind of before and after, an order among the meanings. Huh? But as Thomas points out, we name things as we know them, as we become aware of them. So the order in naming follows the order in knowing. And of course, the basic order in knowing is the road from the senses into reason that we talked about. So obviously you name what is closest to the senses, right? And that's, of course, the act of the eye itself, right? But imagining is more like seeing with the eyes than understanding is. And the sign of that is that in a dream, we think we're seeing with the eyes and we're actually imagining in a dream. It's not until we wake up and have the use of our eyes to recognize that we're imagining rather than seeing, right? But even in a dream, we don't confuse understanding with what? Seeing, right? With the eye, do we? Okay. But sometimes people mix up imagining and what? Thinking. I imagine that's so, I think that's so, right? And you see the English philosophers like Locke and so on, Berkeley, they use the word idea. Sometimes they mean an image, sometimes they mean a thought, and they can't tell the two apart. Okay? But the image is always something, what? Singular, right? Okay. But the thought is basically something universal. Okay. But notice how in the imagination we try to imitate a little bit something like what reason does. We can take, two images and kind of form a new image, right? So I always remember one of the fairy tales when I was a child where there was a glass mountain. Do you remember that one? And how can the prince get up there with his horse on the glass mountain, right? See? Notice, we've seen with our senses a mountain or a hill, right? And we've seen with our senses and felt glass and so on, right? And then we imagine a glass mountain, or you imagine a golden mountain or something, right? And it's a little bit like what you do with the discourse of reason, in the sense that you getting a new image by putting together, right? Two images, right? It's not really coming to know one thing to another, huh? But it resembles more of that, huh? Okay. So, when Shakespeare says looking, trying to see, what sense is using the word to see?
Third sense.
The third sense, right? Okay. Now, why does he add this, right? Huh? Why does he add this? Huh? Why is he not satisfied with saying reason is the ability for large discourse? Huh?
That's one thing that you can go through all the steps, but unless you come to a conclusion, you don't understand it.
Yeah. Unless you, if you think about something but never come to understand it, there's something incomplete, right? Okay. And when reason is thinking and reasoning, it's trying to what? Understand, right? Whereas this motion of reason is not for the sake of motion, but it's for the sake of understanding, right? You're thinking and reasoning, your mind is in motion for the sake of coming to rest in the sense of understanding. Okay? So he wouldn't really be telling us completely what reason is if he says it's ability for large discourse, because you might think that discourse is the ultimate thing that reason is aiming at. No. It's trying to, through its discourse, to come to what? Understand, right? Okay. So you see where he adds that word, right? Okay. Sometimes Aristotle calls philosophy a theoria, which is a Greek word for looking, right? You're looking at things and you're trying to understand them, right? Okay. But in the end, philosophy, as we said before, will be a reasoned out understanding of things. Now, he adds to the word looking now the words what?
Before and after.
Before and after, yeah. And it's interesting how, if you look at most prepositions, if not almost all of them, their first meaning usually is tied up with place in some way.
Oh, yeah.
So the first meaning of in is we're in this room.
Mm-hmm.
Second meaning, part in a whole. The other meanings are further moved. The first sense of before is that I'm before you now, right? Okay. The first sense of under, right, is spatial, right? Okay. What's interesting here is that the word understand is taken from under, but Shakespeare doesn't say, the ability for large discourse looking under. Although he could say that, right? But he says looking what? Before and after, right now. Okay. That's very interesting, huh? Interesting, huh? That we have two different, spatial images, but leading to the same thing, right? To give an example of what I mean here. We think of the cause as being before the effect, right? Okay. Now, that's not the original sense of before, which would be like before the table here, right? But not the cause of the table, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Or yesterday is before today, but it's not really the cause of today, right? But we do speak of the cause as being before the effect, don't we? But we also speak of the underlying cause, right? Okay. So we use two different words, right, with a different spatial image originally, right, to signify the same thing in a way. Huh? Okay. The effect follows upon the cause, right? It's a result of the cause, right? So we think of the effect as coming after the cause. Huh? Okay. But we also speak of the cause as if it were what? Supporting the effect. Huh? And that's what we use that expression, the underlying cause. Huh? And I think I mentioned how in English, the English word for cause is what? Ground. Huh? Did I mention that before? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't use it so much because we borrowed the Latin word cause, right? But you still see it, in the more conservative things like the law, right? where they speak of what?
Oh, grounds.
Grounds for divorce
Oh,
or something,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Meaning cause for divorce, right?
Okay.
Okay. And Shakespeare, as they say, is the master of the English language. Huh? And some people think it was a bad custom, but the Elizabethans were always punning on words.
Yeah.
Okay. And Shakespeare, he's always punning on the word understand. Huh? You know, like the servant. One servant says to the other servant, you know, you don't understand me. I don't understand you. And says, right? Or my king understands me, right?
Yeah.
And I know we're going to put that in the scale of humor, but I mean, it doesn't make you stop and think of the fact that the word to stand under and the word understand have the same etymology, right? Okay, and it's not simply by chance that they do, right? Okay. But the connection between the etymology of the word understanding and the meaning of the word, right, can be seen in this way. You could say that to understand something means to know what stands under it, or what is said to stand under it, right? Or it's to know something through what is said to stand under it. Huh? Okay? So to understand an effect means to know what? The underlying cause of it, right? Okay? Now, the English word for cause here is ground, right? Which stands under other things. Huh? In Shakespeare, in Romeo and Juliet, there he puns on the two meanings of ground. Ground meaning what? Yeah, the earth. And ground meaning the cause, right? Do you know that scene at the end there where after Romeo has arrived at the thing and he finds the Count de Paris there? Remember that? And again, to a little fight because the Count Paris thinks he's come there to desecrate the grave, right? Doesn't realize the truth. And Romeo kills the Count Paris, right? And then he goes in there and he drinks the poison that the apothecary has given him, right? And then he dies, Romeo. Then Juliet wakes up for the potion that Friar Lawrence had given her, right? And she sees Romeo's dead, so she... okay? So, finally the night guard watchmen come on the scene, right? And what the hell is going on here, right? Juliet is supposed to have been dead and buried, and she's laying there freshly bleeding, you know. And Romeo, who's in exile, is laying there dead, and the Count Paris is dead. What's going on, huh? And so the watchman said, "We see the ground whereon these woes do lie, but the true ground we cannot without further circumstance decry." Right? Okay, we see the ground which abides our life, but the true ground, the cause of all these unexpected deaths, right? We don't know, right? Until Friar Lawrence, illuminates us. Okay. So we do speak of the cause as underlying the effect. We do speak of the cause in English as the ground, right? Okay. In Latin, they use the other spatial image. They spoke of the what? Of the effect as depending upon the cause, right?
Oh, yeah.
Not dependent means it hangs from, right? Okay, like a woman's pendant, it hangs from the, down from the other part, right? Okay. But no, she's using a different image, right? One thing you think of the cause as we're supporting something in existence, right? Another thing is holding it up into existence, right?
Yeah.
See? So you have three different images there, right? Spatially. Above and below, right? So Aristotle, will speak of the cause, the first causes being the highest causes. Right? Okay? Because you're thinking of the cause as being above the effect, right? In English, we think of the cause as being the ground, right? And therefore being below everything, right? And but even in Latin and Greek, there's only speak of the underlying cause, right? Okay. And then we also speak of the cause as being before the effect.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So you shouldn't understand in any of these, you shouldn't tie it to the spatial image, right? But you should recognize to look before and after than to say it's to go to look under, right? And before and after are the definition of order, right? Now, everybody who's spoken about reason has really seen a connection between reason and order, right? Okay. Heisenberg in his Gifford lectures, the great physicist, says, in order to understand the world, we have to find some kind of what? Order, right? And we always look in science for laws, right? But we always couple law and order, don't we? If you can't make any sense out of something, you can't find some order. So Shakespeare adds then the word looking, he adds the words before and after. Now, I gave you the text of Aristotle there, where he, in the categories, distinguishes the four central senses before him. And then he adds a fifth sense later on, right? But that fifth sense, I don't think is fifth in order. In some way resembles the what? Second sense. Huh? So use your hand like that, right? Four senses. Now, let's enumerate those senses. Huh? Now, the word before here is an example, like the word to see. It's an example of a word equivocal by reason. Huh? And these words that are equivocal by reason, you'll find that especially the most common words are equivocal by reason. And it was Aristotle who discovered that all the common words, in fact, are the words that are to some extent used everywhere in every science because of that common. And they're used especially in wisdom because its subject is most universal. And which are also the words used in the axioms. That those words are all equivocal by reason. And so to understand those words, you have to see the meanings underlying them, and you also have to see the order of the meanings. Huh? And just like you have these three meanings at least coming under the word to see, but they come in a certain order, right? And the order follows the order in our knowing, right? So likewise with the word before, you follow the order in our knowing. Huh? Now, what Aristotle does with these words is not to distinguish all the meanings. He distinguishes what you might call the central senses, right? And sometimes, though, to one of these central senses you can lead back a number of other senses that have a certain likeness to that. Huh? Okay. So Thompson is explaining the word beginning in the fifth book of Metaphysics. Huh? The first meaning of beginning is this is the beginning of the desk. Okay? And then if you go down the desk here, the motion, the beginning of the motion corresponds in a way to the beginning of the desk, right? And then the beginning of the time it takes to go down here, right? So the beginning of the magnitude is the first meaning of beginning in the physics, in metaphysics. And to that, it's not given explicitly by Aristotle, but to that you lead back the beginning of the motion, if you start from the beginning of the road, and the beginning of the time, right? Okay. Now here he gives us the first meaning, though, not before in place, but before in time. And when you study time, as we'll do in natural philosophy, that's explicitly in the definition of time. There's the number of the before and after motion. Okay? So it's more explicit that before and after in time than in place of motion. To that you reduce these senses. So the first sense is before in time. Okay? And very often in daily life we have that in mind. So today is before what? Tomorrow, right? And today is after yesterday, right? Okay. Now to that sense, as I say, you reduce before in motion, right? And before in the magnitude over which the motion is. Okay. Now the second sense that he gives, well, let me say one more thing about this. Why should the before in time, the before in motion really, be the first meaning of before?
Well, compared to the others,
Okay? We name things as we know them, right? We name things as we become aware of them, huh? And therefore the order in naming follows the order in knowing, right? And the first order in our knowing is the road from the senses into reason. So the first meaning of these words will tend to be something that is the most sensible. Okay? Now what does Shakespeare say in Troilus and Cressida? Things in motion sooner catch the eye than what not stirs. I want to get your attention when you're getting off the airplane, you don't see me. I wait, right? Okay. And that's why ambulances and police cars and so on have these changing lights, right? And changing sounds. Because that will attract attention, right? Lights going on and off and so on. That's why these crazy performers, are jumping around the stage all the time, trying to hold your attention because they have nothing really nice to do. Okay? But almost any movie you see nowadays has some crazy chase, where somebody's chasing somebody up and down. And so notice, time is tied up with the before and after in motion. We usually take the motion of the sun around the earth, right? But there's a before and after there, right? So things in motion sooner catch the eye than what not stirs. So our knowledge begins with our senses, and the senses are caught by motion, right? And time is tied up with the before and after in motion. So this has to be the first sense, right? Okay. Do you see that? It has to be the first sense. Now the second sense of before, which you might call before and being. What does the second sense mean, before and being? Well, when this thing can be without that, but not vice versa, then this is said to be before that. Aristotle takes a mathematical example where he says, 1 can be without 2, right? But 2 cannot be without what? 1. He takes a mathematical example because there's no motion in math, strictly speaking. He wants to show that it's a different sense in the first one, right? Okay. But nevertheless, you can have a before in the second sense here in the sensible world, right? Take a very simple example. Bricks are before a brick wall. Okay. Bricks can be without a brick wall. But a brick wall cannot be without bricks. Okay. Now, very often, what is before in being may also be before in time, right? See? Take, for example, I'm going to write the word cat here on the board. Now, the letter C exists in time before the word cat, doesn't it? Okay? And then I write this, and now finally I have the word cat, right? But notice, C is before the word cat, not only in time, but also in what? Being. Because the letter C can be without the word cat. If I erase this, or have it down here, right? But the word cat cannot be without the letter what? C. Okay. And notice C is before, in this case, in both senses, right? Okay. But suppose we had a stamp here, and bam, you had the whole word cat at once. Then the letter C would not be before the word cat in time, would it? See? But would still be before it in what? Being, right? Okay. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really a different sense than that, right? But still, it's something in the sensible world, right? Or it can be in the sensible world, right? Like the brick, right? The same way, if you take Aristotle's example there of numbers, right? Now, you can have one child without having two, right? But you can't have two children without having one, right? Okay. So one is before two in what? Being, right? Now, usually it's before in time, but not always. You might have twins, your first children, right? So you went from 0 to 2 all at once, right? 2 for the price of 1, as they say. Okay? So, 1 is not always before 2 in time, although it often is, right? So they're really different senses, huh? If you give me a loaf of bread and I take a knife and I cut off one slice, and I cut off a second slice, right? And a third, right? Well, here you have 1 before 2, not only in being, as in Aristotle's example, right? But also in time, right? I have 1 slice in time, shortly, amount of time, before I have 2 slices in time, right? But if I'm in the bakery and I said, we just have that little slice, you know, and she's, whoop, it goes from 0 to, I don't know, 12, 13 slices, whatever it is, right? 14 slices. All at once, right? Okay. So in that sense, 1 is not always before 2 in time, but it's always before 2 in what? Being, right? Okay. Now, is God before us in this first sense of in time?
No.
No. So that puzzling way of Christ saying, you know, where before Abraham was, I am, right? He's not before Abraham in time, right? Because he's not in time, he's in eternity, right? But God is before all creatures in this what? Second sense, right? He can be without any of them, right? But they cannot be without him, right? So he's before in the second sense, huh? Okay. But notice, we're not thinking about God when we first see this sense, right? We're thinking about, well, letter C can be without the word cat, or 1 can be without 2, but not vice versa. Or the bricks can be without the brick wall, but not vice versa, right? If hydrogen, if water is H2O, right? Maybe hydrogen can be without water, but water cannot be without hydrogen, right? Okay. Because this is the second sense. Now, what is the third sense of before, right? Well, if you look at Aristotle's examples, the third sense of before is before in the discourse of reason. Okay. And discourse in both of those senses. Huh? Okay. So not only do in an argument, the premises are before the conclusion, right? Okay. In a definition, the genus comes before the what? Differences, right? And in a treatise of Aristotle, the premium comes before the what? The main body of the treatise, right? Just like in Romeo and Juliet, the prologue comes before the what? Play, right? Okay. Now, to this third sense, though, would be led back any before in our knowing, right? Okay. So the before and after there in an actual road, right? Led back to this sense here, right? It's not the same sense exactly, but it's similar to it, right? Okay. But notice why this is placed third, huh? Because this is not so sensible, is it? This is more inward, right? And so it's not as well known to us as these more sensible, right? This is more sensible than that, though, right? Because things in motion, so they catch the eye and whatnot, right? Okay. Now notice, what is before in the discourse of reason might be before in being, but usually it's not. I'll give you a simple example here. Take example from geometry. Square and cube. Do you see a before and after there of square and cube?
Square before cube.
In what sense?
Because
What
cubes,
sense? What sense?
squares are in cubes.
Okay, so before in what sense here now?
I'm sorry.
Being.
Yes, before in being,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
A square can be without a cube.
Uh-huh.
But a cube, which is contained by 6 squares, right, cannot be without a what? Square.
Mhm.
So square is before cube in the second sense here, right? Now, in geometry, if you get that far, you'll find that plane geometry is learned before what? Solid geometry, right? So square is considered in book 1 and book 2 and so on, right? And even 3 and 4. But cube is not considered until the last books there of the science, right? So square is before cube, both in being and in what? Our knowledge, in the discourse of reason, right? Okay. Likewise, if you take circle and sphere, circle can be without sphere, right? But you can't have a sphere without a what? Circle, right? The way Euclid generates the spheres, he says, imagine a circle and the diameter of the circle, and rotate the circle around the diameter of the sphere. So you have to understand also what a circle is before you can understand what a sphere is, right? Okay? And I guess a cylinder you rotate a what? Rectangle, right? Around one of its sides, right? Okay? And if you rotate a right angle around one of its sides there, that's adjacent to the right angle, right? When it holds it good together, what? Cone, yeah. Okay. Okay. But is that always true? That what is before in being is also before in the discourse of reason? Huh? No. Take the example there, the very difficult one of God, right? God is before all the things in being. Is he before all the things in our knowledge? No. You know, sensible things, material things before we know things. But take an example even from in natural science there. Which is before in being, water or hydrogen?
Hydrogen.
Yeah, before in being. Which is before in our knowledge?
Water.
Yeah. And notice the word hydrogen is named from what?
Water.
Water. Hydrogen. It generates hydro, water. Okay. And why was hydrogen named from water? Because water was more known to us, right? And hydrogen was discovered, I guess, by Lavoisier, yeah? Before they guillotined him, right? That's what happened to him, I'm afraid. It's kind of funny, the way they always attack the church with the Galilean thing and so on, They never attacked the French Revolution, right? They didn't chop off the head of Galileo, they didn't chop off the head of Lavoisier. But anyway, notice, hydrogen is before water in being, but after in what? The discourse of reason, in our knowledge. Okay. And then what about the proton, right? See, a proton comes from the Greek word meaning first, right? Now first is defined by before, right? First means before all the rest. So first has as many meanings as before does, right? In the same way order has as many meanings as before, because order is before and after. But in what sense is a proton first? In being, yeah. A proton can be without hydrogen, but not vice versa, right? Was a proton before hydrogen in our knowledge? No, it's after our knowledge, right? So the order in the discourse of reason is water, hydrogen, proton. The order in being is proton, hydrogen, water. You see? Okay. So these are really different senses, right? So notice sometimes something can be before in more than one of these senses, right? The same thing, right? But not always, right? So they're really distinct what? Senses, huh? Okay. Now, notice a similarity again between these two meanings here, though. Because when you carry the word before over, it's because this here in some ways like that meaning, right? Okay. And just as this can be without that, but not vice versa, right? So likewise, this can be known without that, but not vice versa. And you can see it very much like it in the example I took here first, because the square can be without the cube, but not vice versa. And the square can be known without the cube being known, but the cube can't be known without the square. So there's a similarity there in what? The order in knowing and the order in being, right? There's a likeness there, right? You got two things, and this be without that, but not vice versa, right? And this can be known without that, but not vice versa. Okay? You can know quadrilateral without knowing what a rhombus is, right? But you can't know what a rhombus is without knowing what a quadrilateral is. Okay. There's a real likeness of one to the other, right? There's even a likeness to that first meaning, because in the discourse of reason, there's something like what? Motion, right? Yeah, going from one thing to another. Now, the fourth sense that Aristotle gives is much more unlike the first three senses. Huh? And the fourth sense is the sense of what? Better, right? Before in goodness, you might say. But in one word, the fourth sense is better, right? Okay. So I say to the students, I say, Chaucer comes before Shakespeare in English fiction. But all the critics put Shakespeare before Chaucer. Well, what sense is Chaucer before Shakespeare? Yeah, because he's in the, I guess, 14th century, right? Shakespeare's in the 16th, 17th. But Shakespeare is what? Better, right? Okay. But with the Greeks, Homer comes before, it seems, almost all the other poets, right? Maybe not Hesiod, it's in question. But he's also what? Better than all the rest. Huh? Okay. So we go back to the words of St. John the Baptist there about Christ, right? He who comes after me is before me, and so on.
Oh, yeah.
Well, he's thinking of these different senses, right? Okay. Christ is coming after him in what? Christ is man in time, right? But he's before him in the sense of he's better, right? And so on. Now, when Aristotle is given those four senses, then he comes out and he gives another sense, a fifth sense, right? And if you count, four, this is the fifth sense. But I think it's somewhat, could be mistaken to call it the fifth sense if you thought it comes down here
Different.
in the order, right? I think it's kind of a distant cousin of this before and being, right? Because we speak of the effect as depending upon the cause, right? And what is before and being, right? Or what's after and being, depends upon what is before and being, right? Okay. But as Aristotle points out, how can you, strictly speaking, speak of a cause without having an effect, right? Okay. So they seem to be together, right? The cause and effect here. But in this sense here, something can be without the other, right? But not vice versa. And Aristotle gives an example here where the cause and effect are very much together. He says, it's true that you are sitting, right? Okay? What's the cause of that statement, you are sitting, being true?
The person sitting.
It's your sitting, right? Okay? But is any time lapse between those two? Can you be sitting without that statement at the same time being true? See? And when I sit down, it's false now to say I'm sitting, right? And now I sit down, and a little bit after I sit down, it becomes true that I'm sitting? No. As soon as I'm sitting, that statement is true, right? Okay? And can that statement be true without my sitting? Okay? So it's a different sense than this sense of before and being, isn't it? Because here, the bricks can be without the brick wall, but the brick wall cannot be without the bricks, right? But here, you have cause and effect, right? But I can't be sitting without that statement being true, and that statement cannot be true without my sitting. And yet, my sitting is the cause of the truth of the statement. Okay? I think it's very interesting when you apply this to God, right? Because it's important to see that God is before other things, both in being and as a cause is before an effect, right? Okay? And some people, thought God's causality was something you know, where creatures naturally follow from what God is, right? Spinoza, you know, compares it to if you have a 2, it naturally follows it's got a 4, right? Okay, and if that was so, then the production of creatures would be something that God has no control over, right? It just falls automatically. Right? So it's important to see that God is before creatures, not only as a cause is before an effect, but He's before them in being, right? He can be without them, and vice versa, right? And even if God had always created something, right, He would still be before in being, right? Okay. Just like, you know, that example I took of stamping the word cat, right? All at once. He would still be before the word cat in being, right? Okay. But it's very clear, given there's a beginning for the existence of creatures, right? They didn't always exist, right? If God is before in being as well as a cause is before an effect. Huh? But to avoid the confusion of thinking that this fifth sense is fifth in order, right? I like to call this fifth sense the crowning sense. And especially for the philosopher, it's a crowning sense, because philosophy begins in wonder, right? And wonder is an actual desire to know the cause. So the philosopher, most of all, and ultimately, he wants to look before and after in the sense of cause and effect, right? Okay. And you can, you know, ask that about some of the other senses here, you know. If this is better than that, why is this better than that, right? Right? You know, if this is before that in knowledge, why is this before that in knowledge, right? Huh? And so on, huh? So this is kind of a crowning sense on the ultimate thing, huh? To know why. Huh? Now I ask you my tongue twister question. Peter Piper picked a compare that sort of thing. In what sense of before, right? Does one sense of before come before another sense of before? Guys, the students crazy. See, in what sense of before, right? Does one sense of before, one meaning of before, come before another meaning, right? This meaning comes before this,
Right.
and this before that, and this before that. Right. So, but what sense of before does one meaning come before the other? Yeah. Second?
Third, yeah.
The third, yeah. See? And the reason why is that we name things as we know them, right? We name things as we become aware of them. Not to know something well, but you have to be aware of it in some way to name it, right? Okay. So, the order in naming follows the order in what? Knowing. And that's the third sense. Huh? To this third sense, you reduce any before and after and know it, right? So back to this sense here. Huh? Now, did Shakespeare know all these senses of before, do you think? I notice in the all's well that ends well, he puns upon a meaning attached to this first sentence, before place, in this fourth sense, right? We tend to pun on the first and the last senses because they're the furthest apart, right? When I was a child, my mother would quote this, "I see," said the blind man, but he couldn't see at all, right? Okay. Well, Shakespeare puns upon before the place and before the better. It's a time when a young lady there who's, you know, not of nobility, but she's fallen in love with the Count's son, right? And the Countess suspects, right, that she's in love, you know. And so she kind of forces a confession, right? And Helena says, you know, well then before you, she's kind of kneeling before the Countess, right? I confess that what? Before you, in next to heaven, I love your son. Okay. As Aristotle says there, you know, that even common people will say, what? You come first with me. meaning you're before this sense here, which you love more, right? Okay. All right. Okay. It says there, that even common people will say, what? You come first of me, meaning you're before this sense here, which you love more, right? Okay. So he says, then, needing before you, right? I confess that after heaven, right? And before you, I love your son. So that's heaven, the son, and then the mother, right? Beautiful, though, see? He sees that, huh? That's very striking. I was rereading Romeo and Juliet, and he makes the same point that one is not a number that he makes in the love poem. And I don't know why he does that. It's precision like that, which doesn't seem to serve any poetic reason, but kind of knows it coming back. There he is. What's he doing that for? Now, in what sense of before, and there's as many senses of after as there are before, in what sense of before and after does reason look before and after? All of them, yeah. Even the humble historian is going to look before and after in all these senses, right? The historian is going to first of all try to arrange these things chronologically, right? Okay. And then he's going to start to see, well, you had to have this before you could have had that, right? Okay. He's going to try to see cause and effect of the events, right? Okay. And he's going to, obviously, in his knowledge will have it before and after. He's going to say that this civilization or that, is better than that, right? He's going to look before and after in all of these senses, huh? So reason looks before and after in all these senses, huh? The crowning sense is the one of cause and effect. Notice if wisdom is the highest perfection of reason, you can see the connection between this definition and the fact that the wise man orders, first of all, right? Thomas gives that reason in the commentary that we gave you on the premium to Nicomachean Ethics, right? He quotes Aristotle in the premium to Metaphysics, where Aristotle says that the wise man, right, orders all the rest, right? See, most of all loves order. And Thomas gives us the reason that wisdom is the highest perfection of reason. And it's proper to reason to know order, right? But Thomas also in that text, he divides order in comparison to reason, right? He says there's the order which reason does not make, like the natural order, right? And then there's the order which reason makes in its own acts, which is one thing, and the acts of the will, and then in exterior matter, like the wood or the metal, right? And then he divides the knowledge of reason on the basis of which order it considers, right? So natural philosophy considers the order not made by reason, and metaphysics is also doing that. Logic is considering the order made by reason in its own acts, and in its thoughts and the words that signify those thoughts. And ethics is about the order that reason makes in the acts of the will, and consequently in our actions. And then what he calls the mechanical arts, the servile arts, right? Consider the order made in exterior matter, like the art of carpentry and metalworking art and so on. So the fact that you can distinguish the knowledge of reason by the order it considers, right, is again a sign of how much this is tied up with what reason is. Okay. And I sometimes say, if someone wanted to, say there's a better definition of reason than the one given by Shakespeare, right? You'd have to look before in this sense down here. So you'd have to use his reason in the way Shakespeare defines reason in order to find something better. Or if he says there's some definition of reason that should come before this in our knowledge, you'd have to look before in this sense, right? So in a way, it's kind of a scent, right? He's looking for something already admitting that this is what Shakespeare says, right? So to Shakespeare belongs the glory of giving us, I think, the first definition of reason. He gives us a definition. But notice this is an example of a discourse because we've been defining, right? We're coming to know distinctly what reason is through ability and through discourse, through large, right? And through looking and through before, right? We have to stop at each one of those words and say, what do you mean by discourse? What do you mean by large? What do you mean by looking? What do you mean by before, right? And then you see an awful lot. But from those things you can really come to understand much more fully and distinctly what reason is. Okay, do you see that?
So Aristotle or St. Thomas never gave a definition of reason.
Not like this,
Not-
no. But I noticed in the De Anima there that Aristotle, he doesn't originally call reason nous, which means understanding, right?
Okay.
He calls it the noetikia ability, right? Which is knowing one thing to another.
Oh yeah, okay, I see.
Okay.
So it's getting
And that, in those pages, I don't know if you reproduce those ones for the introduction to logic there, but the one from the Postulation of Aristotle, right, has the same word that uses to describe reason in the De Anima.
Okay.
Okay. Because when I have all Aristotle's works, you know,
Oh, okay.
but you can piece these things together. I don't know why Shakespeare has that. I mean, I don't know why, or why he's so wise. But,
Yeah.
because generally speaking, a man is not a good philosopher and a good poet. They're just so different. You know, Shakespeare himself said, "The lunatic, the lover, and the madman are all compact of imagination." He speaks, compares the poet to the lover and the madman. They're all compact of imagination. So. But the two main exceptions in history to this are Plato and what Shakespeare. Now, if I was going to classify Plato, I'd say he's a philosopher, but he has some poetic gifts that you see in the dialogues.
Okay.
If I was going to classify Shakespeare, I'd say he's a playwright.
Right.
But he has some philosophical gifts. And they're very unusual people, those two guys, you know. Now, just to maybe compare a little bit of the agitation now. Having defined reason, then you can define man and beast, right? Because man is an animal with reason, right? And the beast is an animal without reason, right? Okay. But now, this is an exhortation, which means an urging, right? You're urging people to use reason. Huh? And Shakespeare is telling us what reason is and what it is to use reason, right? Because he defines reason by what is ability for, and that's the use of reason. Large discourse, before and after. But he also touches upon about 5 reasons why we should use our reason, or use it more than we do, right? Okay. Now, these 5 reasons could be divided into 3, right? So look at what's above man, look at what's below man, and look at man himself, right? Or if you want to use the word before and after, you look before man, look after man, and look at man himself. Okay? So, what's above man is God, right? What's below man is the beast. Okay? And of course, man is himself, right? Okay? Now, what reason does he give for using reason in comparison to the beast?
If you don't use reason, you'll be no more than a beast.
Yeah, you fall to the level of a beast, right? Okay? That's a darn good reason for using reason, right? Okay? So, if one does not use reason, one falls to the level of a beast. one of the 5 very good reasons, right? Okay. Now, in regard to what is above man, he gives 2 most excellent reasons for using reason. Huh? What are the 2 reasons that he gives in the exhortation?
God doesn't give anything uselessly.
Okay. So in a sense it will be what? Obeying God, right? With his purpose, right? Sure, he that made us, with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not the capability and godlike reason to fuss in us and use, right? So you can say obeying God, right? Obeying God's plan for us. Okay. And what's the other reference to God? That reference is to the pronoun, right? Sure, he that made us, that's referring to God, right? Sure, he that made us with this reason, gave it to us to what? Not fussed, meaning rusty, moldy, right? Lack of use. Huh? What's the other reference to God?
God-like.
Yeah.
Using this God.
Yeah. Now, he's saying you're going to become in a way like God if you use your reason or use it well, right? Now, in what way is reason God-like? Because when you study God's knowledge, God doesn't have any discourse. God knows all things by knowing himself. He understands everything at once. Right? He naturally understands everything. So reason is godlike insofar as it's what? Able to understand, right? And it becomes more godlike as it actually understands, right? Now, it never understands everything the way God does, but as it becomes more actual, right? It understands more, right? Okay. Thomas is always quoting St. Paul, things which are from God or by God are ordered, right? He's always quoting that text from Judith, right? Which actually uses the word before and after, right? It has a ring to everything. So insofar as reason can what? Look before and after, right? It resembles God in his what? Ordering things. Huh? Okay. And we saw when Aristotle talked about wisdom there in the metaphysics, they spoke of it as being what?
God-like.
Godlike knowledge, right? In the same way, when he gets into practical philosophy and he says, he's talking about achieving happiness for one man. He says, it's lovable, he says, right? To help one man be happy, right? So if I help my friend to be a happy man, or help my son to be a happy man, or my spouse, right? That's lovable, he says, right? But it's more godlike, he says, to help a whole city be happy, right? Okay. And Thomas says, well, God, what? Works for the good of the whole universe, right? He intends the good of the whole universe, right? We can't do that, right? But it's more godlike to aim at the good of the whole city than just the good of one individual, right? Okay. So in both practical philosophy and in looking philosophy, we're trying to be like God so far as possible, right? And that's the definition that Plato gives of philosophy in the Theaetetus, right? Philosophy is becoming like God so far as possible for man. Okay. So that's a very good reason then for using reason, right? So there are 2 reasons in reference to God, right? And using your reason, using it well, you become in some way like God, huh? And you obey God's plan, right, for you, his intentions for you, in giving you reason, right? Okay. Now, in reference to man, there's really 2 reasons, but one's more explicit here than the other. But there's 2 reasons here in reference to man. What is, if you compare the 2 parts of the exhortation there, what is?
Seems like something within us will corrupt. We don't use it to fuss.
Yeah, that's tied up with the reason up here, right? You know, he didn't give us reason to let it mold in us, right? He gave us reason to use, right? So we're obeying him, right?
So chief good.
Yeah. The chief good of man is something more than the chief good of the beast. We saw that in the first part of the premium. And therefore, the chief good of man must involve something that the beast doesn't have, right? And that's reason, as we learned in the second part, right? Okay? So you can say the chief good, meaning the greatest good of man, the chief good and the end or purpose of man, requires the use of reason, right? Now, there are many uses of reason, and of course, in ethics, we'll be more precise as to what use of reason, right? Especially as the end of man. Huh? But at least we know this in education, that man's greatest good, his chief good, right? His very end or purpose must involve the use of reason. Huh? Okay, that's an awfully good reason, right? Now, the last reason is suggested by the words, what is a man, right? But I sometimes bring in the words from the Polonius. This above all to thine own self be true, right? It must follow as a night the day thou canst not then be false to any man. Huh? So a man is true to himself only if he what? Uses reason, right? Okay.